Hello. So this is part 2 of the ideas in speaking about part 3 of this book, Capital in the 21st Century. By Thomas Piketty. You can see I've marked a few bits to talk over, so this might go fast at some points because it's rather late, 2 a.m., and I want to get through all this, then go to bed. Okay, so section 3, or part 3 here, he titles The Structure of Inequality. And so one thing he starts by saying early in the section, the first regularity we observe when we try to measure income inequality in practice is that inequality with respect to capital is always greater than inequality with respect to labor. The distribution of capital ownership and of income from capital is always more concentrated than the distribution of income from labor. Page 244. And I'm taking that to mean basically that everybody works, or, the vast majority of people work. So income that is derived from labor will be such that everybody who works partakes of that income. So that income is generally going to be spread more broadly. So if you have a society where people work for a wage, then if you measure if you measure income just based on how people work, it's going to be less unequal than if you measure income by capital. Income by capital is income due to owning things. He points out here, 50% of people on the planet own essentially nothing. They don't own their house. They might own a few books, a computer, maybe. They may own a cow or something. A 1/10 part of an inheritance of a farm that is 5 acres in size. You might own a car, for example. But compared to, say, a person who owns a house, or a person who owns a business, or a person who owns a skyscraper, you own essentially nothing, right? It is income from capital is concentrated, and he is pointing out here that income from capital concentrates over time. So the entire bit of this entire section 3 of the book, is essentially saying, in one simple statement, that the way that human history has worked for the vast majority of financial records that we know of has been 1% of people own 90% of the stuff, roughly speaking. 0.1% of people own somewhere between 20 to 50% of all things, including land, businesses, castles, ships, weapons, food, for example. Right? Like a farmer may produce the food, but then that farmer sells the food to somebody, and then somebody else owns that food. And the person who owns that food sells that food to somebody else for more money than they bought it for. So what we see time after time is one person is going to own something that a bunch of people produce. A bunch of people produce, they do work, and then one person or one smaller group particularly ends up owning most of that. Okay. And that's because it's capital. It is capital where that happens to, not necessarily labor. Though there are some special circumstances which are quite interesting. He'll get into that. Okay, so he mostly talks about deciles and centiles, 20% of the population, 10% of the population, the top 1%, the 0.01%, that sort of thing. And he's not focused on where people get their income from, how they work, who owns what. He's trying to aggregate all this information worldwide, or at least, as regards Europe and the United States and Asia, the places where there are records going back centuries, decades at least, about who owns what and how much, and so on and so on and so on. So, he's warning that you lose some nuance, right? You can always point out one person or one small group of people who defy the odds, who manage to work hard without inheriting much money or without being given a gift, and pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, essentially, and succeed. You also will find someone who inherited a bunch of money or won the lottery and within a couple of years had lost it all, thrown away on bad investments, had a gambling problem. That's that sort of issue, right? So you're always going to find these problems and these exceptions to every rule. But he's trying to say that this is how his research suggests societies work, the world works, the world that uses money, at least, which is, pretty much all of us at this point. Okay, but it can be complex. Okay, he says, for example, many people belong to the upper class in terms of labor income, but to the lower class in terms of wealth, and vice versa. Right? You can be house rich and money poor. You can have a lot of income, but also live in San Francisco and be unable to buy an apartment, sort of thing. There are complexities in all these cases. So he's looking at the upper 5 or 10% or 20% and the bottom 50%, the bottom 20%, that sort of thing. And he's saying, this may look differently if you focus on certain areas. If you focus on the city of New York, then things may look a bit different. You might expect that someone who makes $500,000 a year owns their own house. Hey, maybe they're in New York and they own like half an apartment. But nationwide, it's very, very likely that someone who makes that amount of money will own a lot of stuff. It's sort of what he's saying. It's not guaranteed, however. Someone might also own 400 acres, and those 400 acres may be worth $200,000. But 400 acres in, say, the middle of Dallas is going to be worth a lot of money. It's all about where you are. But if you aggregate it, if you say, okay, well, what about the people who own the most money? Well, then you can say, look, they own, half the land is owned by small farmers, but the land that small farmers own just is not worth much. It's used for growing crops and not much else. But, 5% of land is owned by rich industrialists, but that 5% of land owned by rich industrialists is, land in the middle of cities, or land that factories are built on, or land that's prime real estate for building houses and investing. So it's worth a whole lot of money. You can always find exceptions, but he's just saying, there are complexities here that you have to deal with. And, he's opening up space for himself to be criticized, and preemptively defending his choices. Okay. And this is interesting that I sort of see what's going on here. Okay. So he says, for this half of the population, the bottom half of the population, as regards wealth, the very notions of wealth and capital are relatively abstract. For millions of people, wealth amounts to little more than a few weeks' wages in a checking account, a low-interest savings account, a cat, and a few pieces of furniture. The inescapable reality is this: wealth is so concentrated that a large segment of society is virtually unaware of its existence, so that some people imagine that it belongs to surreal or mysterious entities. That is why it is so essential to study capital and its distribution in a methodical, systemic way. At the other end of the scale, the richest 10% own 60% of total wealth. So I see his point here. I live in a poorer area. It's not quite the worst gang-ridden ghetto on the face of the planet, but it's not necessarily safe to walk the streets at night along the main boulevard either. This is a sort of a town that's a little left behind, not doing terrible, not doing great. We have crime problems, drug problems, homeless problems, but at the same time, the streets are mostly clean. The school suffices. There's a satellite system of the local community college in our town, not an actual community college, just like an outreach center where you can take a few classes. It's a middle of the road sort of city. But even in my town, the vast majority of people I know maybe might own their own house, and that's about it. I know plenty of other people who live like he is describing here, paycheck to paycheck. I have a friend, who's my age, and his notion of, I'm wealthy, I'm good, I can quit my job. I can quit my third job, technically, right? Is I've got, $2,000 in the bank account. And it's not in stocks or bonds. It's not invested. It's just like I fall back. I have a few weeks worth of wages. I have a month, maybe a month and a half worth of rent saved up. So if something goes wrong, I feel I have an egg I can pull up and live with. And he's angry about not getting paid enough for his job or getting half the time of work he wants to, or his boss is calling him in when they need to, and so on. And his main focus is, the managers, the people who he interacts with day by day. Maybe he might have an interaction with, say, an area manager who works over, 8 to 10 stores or 15 stores or 12 stores or something in the Central Valley area of California or something like that. Or in Ohio, the person who, all the stores in Ohio, a statewide representative of the company. And this is his focus, but he doesn't know anyone who's more than vaguely well off. He doesn't know anyone who's rich. He doesn't know anyone who goes for vacations every year to Disneyland. Whereas I do, right? I'm sort of in the middle there, where I've met people who, have their houses filled with Disneyland paraphernalia because they go there every year and they love it and it's great. It's like a 2-week vacation every single year. And it's on and on and on. I know people who are, retired, and they're not only retired sitting in a home somewhere, they're retired on a cruise ship and traveling the world and having adventures. Maybe we want to say a week in Barcelona. Maybe we want to rent an Airbnb for 2 months in Chile, sort of thing. And then I also have people who's like, well, I've known this one guy in my town for basically my entire life, and he worked his entire life. He ended up running out of money, getting kicked out of his apartment, had to wait 3 years until he got Social Security to move back into an apartment, and his wealth is essentially zero, zilch, nothing, right? And I'm thinking, this is how most people live, just sort of working, and you save a little bit of money and you're good. I have a few $1,000s in an IRA, for example, and I save a little bit. I'm like, it's not going to save me in retirement from not having a good wage. It's going to not be great. At the same time, I've looked at the other and I'm like, well, this year I saw my returns go up 10%, gain 10% in that. But then I also have relatives who take their money and put it in a checking account and let it sit there, and inflation just cuts away at that year after year after year. And hey, you may have it may feel great having $5,000 or $10,000 in a checking account you managed to save up, but without investing it, you're going to have a problem eventually, because it doesn't do anything. And so you have to go work and work and work and work. And hopefully you get a raise, or the minimum wage raises, depending on what sort of job you have. And you capture some of the wealth of the planet, But lots of people, that's not how it happens. And when you walk along the streets of my town, what tends to hit me is, everything is owned by somebody. The streets are owned by the city, and the city is in debt. So the city owes money to somebody. So someone, by proxy has a draw upon the roads and the light rail. And when I walk along the street, I see, houses and a factory maybe, and lots of shopping centers. And each of those shopping centers is owned by a person. By design, I think you look at the shopping centers and there's one or two that have like one resident in them, and all the other stores are empty. And it says right on there in a big advertisement, if you want to rent this space, call this number, and it has the name of a company beneath it. And there's two or three companies, you notice their names, but I don't know who owns those companies. I don't know who runs those companies. I can sort of find out, but it's vague, I would say. So a company owns this, or a company owns that, or maybe I know a person who owns the grocery store, and I don't know how rich that makes them. I don't really know how wealthy that is. It's all sort of abstract. It's sort of vague. How much is a building worth? What's the upkeep on it? What's the return? These aren't facts which enter on my mind very often or commonly. I'm not involved in that situation. I'm not involved in that level of wealth and return. And I feel like I at least can see that there's more to the money and ownership and capital situation in America than most people interact with. You're not thinking about who owns your company. You're not thinking about the CEO and how much he makes, and if he's really getting a good return on his labor. Are you overpaying him? Are you underpaying him? Or you not? And you hear words like, "Oh, $600,000. You paid the CEO $4 million. My manager got a bonus, and I don't know how much that bonus is. Maybe that bonus is $200. Maybe it's $5,000." But at a certain point, numbers just become sort of abstract. $500,000. That's probably a nice house in an okay area, on the edge of a nice town. This isn't the middle of San Francisco money, but you could get something in Modesto for $500,000, and that's a fine place to live and exist. It's not in the middle of nowhere. Maybe if you went into the country, you could get yourself 40 acres and a house off grid or something, and you would be able to survive. But once it gets to 2, 3, 5 million, it's harder to understand those numbers. And when you get to 100 million or $1 billion, what does it even mean? Right? Like what percentage of that? How does it affect your life? What do you do with that money? And how do you think when you have to preserve that money and keep it working? It's not just wages at that point. It's not like you have to become if you have $100 million to your name, it's not like you have to work for a living. And that's an interesting situation to be in, where I can catch sight of the lower bounds of wealth, and I can catch sight of the poor and destitute, but I feel like I sort of stand outside that in a way, I'm not rich in the sense that I have money, but I'm also not poor in the sense that I'm worried I'm going to be kicked out of my apartment because I didn't work my 48 hours this week, sort of bit. And what he's talking about here, I think, is sort of how do we think about wealth in our society? Most people, I would agree with him here, are simply focused on survival today, on survival to next week, on saving up for a rave or for retirement maybe in 60 years, sort of vaguely, without devoting their every day to how much money they made or how much money was made off of them, or if their lifestyle is sustainable for the next 10 years, what do you expect to happen, and so on. But ultimately, these do affect us. The structure of capital, the relation of income to wages, whether we have a minimum wage, whether we have a national health insurance bit, how likely is it that you are going to be in trouble? Is your company taking on massive debt and gonna go out of go into bankruptcy in a couple of years, go out of business, and then you're on the fence. If you have money invested with the company somewhere, like, do they own it? Is it stock? And it's so bloody tiring to think of that all the time. But maybe we could spend a few moments going into it, watching a YouTube video, reading a book, and just thinking about it, or walking down the street and going, I don't actually know who owns what. I have no idea the income levels of this. Who am I paying my rent to? Why is my rent set at a certain level? And so on. Okay, so he's talked earlier in this book about the structure of capital or wealth changing from 1910 to 1945 due to the two world wars and a lot of inflation and economic shocks and things getting destroyed and so on. He also talks here about Britain's wealth. 25% of Britain's wealth was foreign based. You owned a plantation in Tahiti or Cuba. You owned stock in a company that existed in South Africa. You had government bonds for Russia, which were useless after the war, as the Soviet Union takes over and invalidates all those, or as Britain's empire is dismantled and the countries nationalize their own resources and production centers. Your stock in such and such a company becomes worthless. And 25% of Britain's wealth, for example, of like colonial wealth, France and Germany and whatnot, would have had similar, if lesser numbers, is the same. So as the world changes, wealth disappears. And what he likes to point out a lot is that after this time period, you saw a redistribution of wealth. And we saw what we call the rise of the middle class. Now, there's always been sort of a middle class in America, and he attributes that to the fact that America was expanding and growing at times. He has this equation: R is greater than G. The return is greater than growth. And for a long time, the return on capital in America, no matter how high it might have been, was smaller than the growth of the American economy. As all these people joined in to the great nation, and all these towns needed to be built, and the railroads needed to be built, and people were heading westward, and they needed, guns. They needed horses and wagons, and they need, saws and nails. A whole production center pops up as the population of the planet explodes. They need clothes, and we grow cotton, or we grow flax, or we farm sheep in the Great West, in those open areas. And so America expands and expands and expands. And then World War II happens. World War I, you have this destruction of all the production in Europe. So U.S. is mostly unscathed. You have a rise of the middle class. So we've seen in but maybe not my lifetime, right? But in the lifetime of most people who would be watching this, of most people alive today, in the lifetime of my grandparents, for example, the rise of the middle class worldwide. You can go anywhere on the planet and you can find people who have an okay job, own their own house, or at least have paid off most of the mortgage for a house, and plan to retire, maybe not wealthy, maybe not rich, but enough to survive, right? They're not working every second of every day just to make it. They can rest on their laurels because they've worked hard and they've earned it. And what he likes to point out is that this is a very strange situation. The vast majority of human civilization has not been like this. The vast majority of human civilization has had a much greater inequality. And so what we have today with a middle class, where he points out, I think, the 40% of the population, the middle class that is, or yeah, 40% of the population, the middle class that makes between, what does he say here? Like $20,000 to $200,000 a year, owns what, like something like 30% of wealth. Okay. Whereas in the past, so to go back a century in time, the decade 1900 to 1910, the 1%, the wealthiest 1% alone owned more than 50% of all wealth. The upper 10% exceeded 60%. On the other hand, the middle 40% owned just over 5% of national wealth, right? So the middle class in the past, 100 years ago, owned 5% of the national wealth. Today, the middle class, that 40% of the population that makes what we would call a decent wage, owns like 30 to 35%. Which sounds relatively a lot until you realize that 40% of people that owns, let's say 35% of wealth, still owns less than its equal share of wealth. And within that 40%, you have a difference of $20,000 to $200,000 a year you'd be making, right? There's a very huge change here, and wealth becomes more concentrated at the top because it's capital that gets more concentrated at the top, because once you have $200,000 a year coming in, you can invest more of that than if you had $20,000 a year coming in. So he points out here that in the last 100 years, basically all the middle class managed to get its hands on was a few crumbs. Scarcely more than a third of Europe's wealth and barely a quarter in the United States. This middle group has 4 times as many members as the top 20%, yet only 1/2 to 1/3 as much wealth. So when you look at it this way, the top of the line, that 1% of super rich landowners, knights and nobles and captains of industry and robber barons, who 100 years ago owned 50% of all wealth, today he says own 20 to 30% of all wealth. But we haven't equalized anything. This is not a socialist paradise by any means. Is basically what he's pointing out. And what these numbers suggest is that the middle class is more precarious than we expect. That, as the middle class ages and wealth becomes more concentrated over time, that percentage of capital of wealth that the middle class owns will disappear. And it may, according to him, disappear quite fast because it grew quite fast. But most of this growth he's talking about, where the middle class grows from 5% of wealth to 35% of wealth, happens between 1945 and 1970. Happens in 25 years. And he says after 1970, it starts to go the other way. And he marks 2050 as what his model suggests is the turning point, where wealth becomes concentrated almost to the degree it was in the 1900s. He said that's what this whole section is basically about. It's warning that we are headed back towards the medieval era. You are headed back towards small groups of people owning almost everything, and the vast majority of folk not owning anything. And even if you have a middle class wage today, if you're in the lower end of that, if you're on $20,000, $30,000, you are not owning your own house. It's not going on. You need to be in the upper half of that section nowadays. And if you are owning your own house, you are inheriting it, most likely. You might be able to build yourself a little 2-room cabin off-grid in the middle of the forest. But if you're in the center of town, you are not owning your own house on that sort of money. The bank isn't going to give you a loan for that amount. You have to move out and to extent, this has always been the case. You know, the rich, if the rich part of the planet, the rich part of our society, the rich part of America is going to own the nicer houses. If you're not super rich, you can't quite afford that. You can get an okay house. If you're, just sort of barely making it by, you might be able to get a house, but you'd be probably renting. If you are 50% of the population, you are renting, and you're never going to own a house. And why is that? Like, well, what is happening? Why is it that in the past, our parents and grandparents could, generally speaking, work hard and then buy a house in their 20s, pay off their mortgage and retire, and then end up relatively wealthy today? Well, he talks about in here the concentration of capital. Particularly, he says, at one point, it's quite possible for someone to retire at 60, say it's 1980, retire at 60, and then be richer at 85 than they were at 60. How does that happen? I mean, you're not taking in more money. Well, he says it's concentration of capital, right? You have Social Security pays for all your living expenses. You own a house, and now any spare money you have gets invested. That house goes up in value 10 times over the course of 50 years or something. And you gain money just by owning something, not by working with that ownership. You have a few spare dollars that you invest in Apple, and all of a sudden you are a millionaire 25 years later. You got lucky. Or maybe you were smart and you saw how the future was going. It's sort of up in the air at that point. But today, it's much harder to do. Why is that? Because concentration of capital. The stock market is going up like crazy this year. Why is that happening? Because people with money invested in the stock market. The price of the stock goes up as more people are willing to buy that stock because they're willing to pay more for that limited amount of stock that's on sale. So the stock price goes up. So if the stock price is going up, that means people with money have spare money that they want to put somewhere and grow. And he's basically saying, there is a smaller amount of the population that has that spare money to spare because wealth builds upon itself. We might think the middle class is won, but middle class is very frail. Middle class could disappear in 30 years because it grew in 30 years. And he has some charts here on 273 and 272. But he's basically saying the wage level has obviously changed a great deal over the past century, and the composition and skills of the workforce have been totally transformed. The wage hierarchy has remained more or less the same. If top incomes from capital had not decreased, income inequality would not have diminished in the 20th century. So basically what that means, as I understand it, okay, it goes here. The least well-paid, 50%, always received 25 to 30% of total wages, with no clear long-term trend. So basically, a shopkeep, a grocery store in 1900, paid a certain percentage of its income, a certain percentage of all the money it gained by selling items to its employees. And today, they would be about the same, right? I'm making up these numbers, right? But if 50% of your overhead for a business was wages in 1900, then it's more or less likely that today, if you have that same business, 50% of your overhead would also be wages. Is what he's saying here. I think that's how I would interpret this. The wage hierarchy has remained more or less the same. Minimum wage jobs have always been around. And minimum wage today is set by law. Minimum wage in the past would have been a more pure version of it, like the amount of money you needed to survive and come into work every day, which does not mean in the past the amount of money to own a house or to own a car. You may have had to walk 3 miles uphill both ways to get to work, and the company would have paid you that money to survive that way because, hey, you got to work. We're not paying you to build a life. We're paying you to do work for us, sort of bit. So even if it seems like you're making more money today, that doesn't mean that we're making a better percentage of the money. Minimum wage workers are making the same percentage of all wages today as they would have 100 years ago. The CEOs of companies are making the same percentage of a company's, income that they would have made 100 years ago. So we ask about why does the boss of, I don't know, Chrysler or GM or something get paid $2 million? Well, $2 million is like 0.7% of the company's profit. And so it's a giant company. That's what they get paid. Something like that is sort of what we're talking about here. So why did income become more equalized? Well, he says income became equalized because top incomes from capital have decreased. Right? So if I own a company and 50% of my weight of my the money I intake of my operating expenses, right, are for for my workers, and then let's say 25% I reinvest in the business, and then 25% I take out so that I own it, so that I have something to have it, so I live off of it. Then I still own that company, right? And that company would be, reinvesting 25% of its proceeds every year in that company, and I would be making money off the company that I owned. So the workers, meanwhile, get their wages, go home, spend their wages on survival, on renting, on putting their kids through college. And I have 25% of the company that I'm, 25% of the company's income that I'm relying on to live my life, which, depending on the size of the company, may be a small house in suburbia, or it might be a mansion, or it might be I own 3 jets. Who knows? But then you also have that 25% that I'm reinvesting in the company each year. And so I'm saving a massive amount of wealth by reinvesting in the company every year. And because I own the company, as the company grows, I get richer and richer and richer and richer and can do what I want with it. And eventually what happens is 50% of my expenses might still be for the workers. That might stay the same as the economy grows, but the 25% that I make off of the company that I'm spending on my own lifestyle eventually becomes large enough that I don't need to take all that 25% to spend on my own lifestyle. I can start taking 20% spending on my own lifestyle, 25% investing in the business, and 5% investing in other stock or in buying a third house, and renting it out sort of thing. I think is how I would interpret that. So I'd be gaining money as capital grew because I owned something. But if the return on capital is less, if I'm still spending 50% of my expenses of my company's expenses on wages, but now I have to invest 35% in the company just to keep it going, because of inflation or depreciation, or there's troubles in the company or something like that, then I don't have that extra money and so on. And I'm talking about percentages here, but most notably, capital builds itself up over years, decades. So a minor level of inflation of 2 or 3% year on year doesn't mean much, but then let's say inflation is 3%, then what is that? What would that be? 30 years from now, it's 100%. Like a dollar, 3%. I'm doing math here on camera, which I should not do, but 3% a year, and say 10 years would be 30%. So 30 years would be 90% inflation off of that first one, but it would also be 3% building on itself. 103%, then 3% of 106%. Sort of, what's the word for that? It would be compound interest, so it'd be even greater. Anyway, what I'm saying is, you want the returns on capital have gone down. So the great landowners aren't making as much money just because they own land. The great factory owners, the great capitalists aren't making as much money just because they own something. It costs them more to upkeep their situation. It costs them more to upkeep the factory. They have to spend more on their workers because the minimum wage is raised, because their workers join a union, because their workers demand a living wage, not just a survival wage. And this happened in 1910 to 1945, then 1945 to 1970, so on. And now it's starting to reverse. Now it's starting to be that the return on capital is overwhelming growth. It's overwhelming wage growth in this case. Okay. And so it's that point which we want to pay attention to. So we hear about the economy growing all the time. Economy's growing. And then, especially for me and people I know, it's like, where? Who is this economy growing to? I went to the store and it was $5 for a can of tomatoes, a can of crushed tomatoes. I'm like, $5? I saw a can of black beans for like $1.89. And I go, oh, that's cheap. But in the back of my head, I'm going, 10 years ago, that was 89 cents flat, not $1.89, which has doubled in price in 10 years. And, you look at the stock market and it goes up and up and up and up and up. And you hear great news, like, what is happening? Where's all this money going? Like, it's $5 for a can of tomatoes. Well, obviously someone's making a whole lot of money off of that, and it's not me. Prices go up because things are more expensive, but all I hear about is the economy growing and people becoming richer. And what was it? I remember when Bill Gates was the richest man on the planet, and he had something $40 billion or something. Now you read about Elon Musk and $400 billion, and you go, wait, 40 billion to 400 billion in the course of 20 years. That's a whole lot of growth in what counts as the richest person on the planet. Right? Like, what's going on here? Someone is making a bunch of money. There is some, and it's not necessarily because they're stealing from us. It's they're growing faster. That 40 billion invested over 20 years grows to a huge amount of a huge pile of money. But my $10,000 invested over 20 years grows to what? 25,000? The rates of growth for large fortunes and small fortunes are not the same. So he gives some numbers here. From 1977 to 2007, we find that the richest 10% appropriated 3/4 of the growth. The richest 1% alone absorbed nearly 60% of the total increase of U.S. national income in this period. Hence, for the bottom 90%, the rate of income growth was less than 0.5% per year. Basically, he's saying the rich are not only rich, they are becoming richer. And they're becoming richer very, very fast. So the economy is growing. And if you don't see if I don't see in my town the economy growing, but I hear information about the economy growing, that means somebody I don't see, I don't interact with, I don't know, I don't hear about is capturing that growth. That's really where the danger is. We hear about I was watching some YouTuber last year going on about the government of England, the government of Britain, who had given out a bunch of money during COVID. And it turns out that the money they spent during COVID, something, 60% of it went to like 5 companies or something, 60% of it went to the top 10% of the population. So you have a country borrowing a bunch of money and spending that money. And who are they spending that money on? Well, it turns out they are spending that money on something that is owned by somebody. So what happens is most of that money that they inject into the economy is used to buy something, which grows someone else's wealth, and it's like a pyramid, right? It's like a reverse river, perhaps. You're funneling all this money in, and it's like a funnel. It starts to focus on a smaller and smaller group of people, a smaller and smaller group of very, very, very rich people whose growth is exponential, or something of that sort, exponential, right? So it's really about growth being captured. And so if you hear that the economy is growing, but your wealth is not growing, the economy is growing, but I mean, houses are more expensive, food is more expensive, gas is more expensive, the stock market is roaring, but you can't buy as much of the stock market. Well, somebody is growing faster. Somebody's getting all this wealth. And it's not terribly bad in the course of a year, but over 10 years, my little IRA that grows, 100% means nothing compared to somebody else's 40 billion that it grows 100%. As regards percentage of wealth. And this is interesting thing, right? The recent research based on matching declared income and tax returns with corporate compensation records allows me to state the vast majority, 60 or 70% of the top 0.1% of the income hierarchy in 2010 consisted of top managers. By comparison, athletes, actors, and artists of all kind make up less than 5% of this group. In this sense, the new U.S. inequality is much more to do with the advent of super managers than with superstars. So if we think of rich and famous people, we often think of athletes and movie stars. Or, famous musicians. They're rich, and he's basically saying not the people you hear of as rich, the people you see on TV are, what do you say, 5% of the wealthy people on the planet. There are the wealthy people in the country. He's talking about the U.S. particularly here. The people who make 200, 300, 400,000 a year, he says the top 0.1%, 1.5 million. The people who make $1.5 million a year, for the most part, are upper managers of companies who we don't see or interact with or know, who we don't hear about. They aren't in the news. They aren't flashing their money. They're just slowly existing in a comfortable situation, buying a yacht, buying a third house, in buying shares of stock by the hundreds or thousands. Whereas I'm going, hey, maybe I can buy 90 shares of Intel, because I think it's a good investment at this time, because they're rock bottom, and where else are they're going to go but up? And you have somebody out there thinking, oh, it's a Tuesday, and Intel's kind of sort of a good bit here, so I'll buy 900,000 shares of it because I think it's a good bet. And there's not something quite wrong with that. There's something odd, right? That power and wealth is so concentrated and so quiet. Wealth doesn't show on the face of things. And wealthy people generally speaking, don't live where I live, don't have houses where I am. And if they do, I don't know it because they're not flashing and flaunting their money. They're just slowly surviving, and their kids will have a better life than my descendants would have, for example. And this isn't bad, but a concentration can cause problems, right? There was a news article I remember reading saying something about in 2004, the top 10% of households drove 50% of all consumption. So the base of the U.S. economy grows narrower and narrower and narrower, relying on fewer and fewer people, and which it's more unstable. Because some economic problem that strikes one segment of the population, say a giant stock market crash, which is absolutely horrible for people who own stock, but should have very little effect upon the average minimum wage worker. But if most consumption is due to that group of people who own stock, then the whole consumption order of the United States is more frail. So a stock market crash, which directly affects a small group, may end up having a call-on effect where it starts to expand and result in changes for the entire economy of the entire country, which affects all these minimum wage workers who don't know a damn thing about the stock market and couldn't care less if Apple went down 25% this day. Except they have to, because it affects them indirectly. So that sucks, right? You feel as if you're at the whim of fate. Except it is not fate. It's not a natural disaster. It's not an earthquake. It is the decisions of a small group of people. And you're saying, the small group of people today in the U.S. seem to be managers, seem to be, CEOs, vice presidents, that sort of thing. Which, at least in the U.S., does tend to reflect our intuition, I think, that it's companies where wealth is really growing. Sometimes there are individuals who create great artwork and work and work and work and own all their own albums and stuff like that. Suddenly, it starts to grow like crazy, and you're a billionaire. There are people who work hard and become one of the 70 or 700 NFL players who join each year or continue each year, and they work hard and they make millions of dollars because they're one of the few at the best at what they do. But the vast majority of folk are good at managing. They're good at directing people. So what does that mean if those are the group that's getting richer and richer? It means that some of the productivity gains, some of the wealth gains have been concentrated, right? This is reflected in CEO pay. I'm making up these numbers again, but it's something like in 1980, the average CEO got 10% what the lowest paid worker did. And today, the average CEO gets 40 or 400% or something like that, what the minimum wage worker gets. And so we want to pay attention to the percentages here. They're not just getting more money, not just making more money. It's that we are paying the top people in companies a greater percentage of the money. The wealth becomes concentrated and concentrated and concentrated, and we think the CEO is worth that $1.5 million a year. Or somebody does. Somebody does, right? Because the other problem, of course, is ownership of companies, is ownership of stock, for example. If wealth becomes concentrated and fewer and fewer people own wealth, then you get things like activist investors, single people who own enough money to buy a percentage of a company and change how it acts. Where one person can decide what happens to tens of thousands. And what does that smacks of the medieval era. That smacks of the past. That smacks or speaks to me of nobles and princes, which we may not have reached, but once that concentration of wealth is there, how far away can it be? The structure of the world gets set up to protect the people who already own most of the world. And if the people who own most of the world are the middle class, if the people who own most of the world are the workers who build themselves up, who create things, if the people who own most of the world are the singers and the artists, the great athletes who work hard and make it, if the people who own most of the world are the engineers and the software developers and the entrepreneurs who start companies and build factories, then that's a world that seems relatively okay, at least morally speaking. But if the vast majority of people who own the world are those who tell other people what to do, we might be in trouble. It's the knock-on effect. Our society changes due to how our society acts before. 10 years ago affects what happens today. We don't always know how that's going to work out, but we can make guesses. And a growing inequality in wealth is dangerous because we know where that leads. We know where that goes. We know what sort of life that is because we've had it in the 18th, the 19th, and the 17th centuries. A few people who rest in their laurels and the vast majority of people who work in slums. We may not aim for that, but it is a distinct possibility and one we probably want to avoid. Okay, he says, inequalities at the bottom of the U.S. wage distribution have closely followed the evolution of the minimum wage. But nevertheless, inequalities at the top of the distribution increased steadily throughout this period. Clearly, the minimum wage has an impact at the bottom of the distribution, but much less influence at the top where other forces are at work. So, this is interesting, right? Let's say what happens if we raise the minimum wage? The poorest workers gain wealth. The richest owners do not lose wealth. So where's the wealth coming from? The wealth is coming from the middle, right? The wealth is coming from the center, which, simplifying here, I think means something like, let's say you have a big company, right? You raise the minimum wage. All your minimum wage workers, their wages go up 10%. Their manager's wage goes up 5%. His manager's wage goes up 1%. And we're 4 levels deep in the managers now. Their wages go up 0.5%. But then you get up another level, and what are we, 6 levels up? The sixth level, when you get to CEOs and vice presidents, their wages go up 15%. And then you get the CEO and his wage goes up 25%. So somebody's getting squeezed, is what he's saying. When you raise the minimum wage, somebody's getting squeezed. And it's going to be the people in the middle. It's going to be the middle managers who just don't have enough power to change the company or change the situation, but also do not want to get fired and become one of those minimum wage workers, right? The people who have house payments, it's the middle class, right? The people who have house payments, they have to keep up. The people who have children they want to send off to school, the people who are nearing retirement age, they're 55 and they're like, I just need to hold on for 10 more years and I'm not making the wages I think I should, but I don't want to leave this company behind because I'm loyal to it, or I don't want to, find another job at 55. Geez. Right. So what we expect to happen is we raise minimum wage, companies' total profits go down, everybody on the top loses money, or at least doesn't gain money as fast, and everybody on the bottom gains money faster. But what's really happening is minimum wage raises the poorest up, drags the middle down, concentrates wealth at the top, because the concentration of wealth has other avenues at play, has other effects going on, has other reasons they're gaining money. Oh my gosh, I have so much more to go and I'm losing my voice already. So I'm going to keep trying to speed this up. So again, the central fact is that in all the wealthy countries, including continental Europe and Japan, the top thousandth, that's a mouthful, enjoyed spectacular increases in purchasing power in 1990 to 2010. The average person's purchasing power stagnated. Basically, just saying again, look, the ultra rich gained a lot of money. The regular person did not gain a lot of money. He didn't lose money, but it didn't gain a bunch of money. So it's capturing growth again. The economy is growing, and where is this growth of the economy going? To the richest centile. The richest 10, the richest 20%, the richest 1% are growing, are capturing the improvements in productivity, for example. Okay. As noted, the vast majority of top earners are senior managers of large firms. It is rather naive to seek an objective basis for their high salaries and individual productivity. When a job is replicable, in the case of an assembly line worker or fast food server, we can give an approximate estimate of the marginal product that would be realized by adding one additional worker or waiter. But when an individual's job functions are unique or nearly so, the margin of error is much greater. Basically, he's saying, look, there is no reliable way of telling whether the CEO is worth $1 million a year or $10 million a year. Because there are very few CEOs at that level. There are very few companies that need CEOs at that level. There are very few examples to choose from, right? Because each CEO's job is going to be unique. They're going to face different challenges during different time periods. The CEO you needed 5 years ago may not be the CEO you need today. But the assembly line worker you needed 5 years ago, you generally know if you still need them today. Right? The job is replicable. How many assembly line workers do you need to hire? Well, if you have 400 of them, then you know how much money you get, how much money you gain, the profit you make from each one. But if you hire one CEO every 5 years, it's difficult to tell whether you pick a good one or a bad one. It's basically what he's saying. It's a more unique job. It's harder to judge the worth of it. But I think it's also important to sort of look at if productivity in a company goes up, but minimum wage in the company does not, what's going to happen? What's going to happen is that the higher level managers and the owners of that company's stock gain money. So if production goes up, but you don't pay the workers more, then somebody captures that wealth created by an increase in production. So you have this. So if a company is doing well, you have a battle between the owners and the workers, for example. The workers say, I want a higher wage because we're making more money. And the owners are saying, I want a higher return because we're making more money. And you end up fighting out. But in America, at least, when you don't have a union, the owners are going to win that most of the time. When you can fire the lower wage workers whenever, for whatever reason, you have a lot of power in deciding how the profits are split. So you have the rich again winning out. And this isn't because the rich are bad or evil or selfish or anything like that. It's just everybody acts for their own interests, and we have set up a society or a system where the interests are favored. Certain interests are favored over others simply by the system we have set up, the tax on capital gains, right? If you don't take your gains as dividends, then it just, you reinvest in the company, and the company is worth more, so capital gains goes up. So the owners are gaining money, but the workers are not seeing that money because it's just the company investing in something, buying a machine, buying AI, and so on. So again, the point he's making is that it's a structural system. He pointed this out at the beginning of the chapter. He's not talking about individuals and whether they're good or bad or evil or nice or smart or dumb. He's talking about how our methods of taxation, for example, are set up and what effects that ends up having. Okay. Yeah, so inequality of income from labor did not decrease in a structural sense. The sharp drop in total income inequality was due essentially to the collapse of high income from capital. Basically, what happened in 1910 and 1945 is not only did capital receive less return, but the super rich, the dukes and the robber barons of the era lost a lot of their money in the wars, and due to inflation and so on. You saw here we had the Great Depression, and the stock market went down, massive numbers, and you had people who owned that stock, killing themselves because all their money was gone. That sort of thing. Whereas a worker isn't necessarily going to kill himself. He's thinking, I'm going to have another job. Capitalists might look at that. An owner of stock may receive a gigantic shock because, hey, if you were one of those super duper rich, you never worked a day in your life. You didn't have to. At least not in the 1920s. That was not expected of you, is sort of what he's saying or suggesting. So it's a much greater shock because you may have lost not just a job, not just what you needed to pay rent next week, but you may have lost what you relied upon to survive. If your company goes bankrupt and 90% of your wealth is in that company, you're screwed. If your company goes bankrupt and you work for that company, it sucks, but you might be able to survive. Okay. Thus, throughout most of human history, he says, the inescapable fact is that the rate of return on capital was always at least 10 to 20 times greater than the rate of growth of output and income. Indeed, this fact is to a large extent the very foundation of society itself. It is what allowed a class of owners to devote themselves to something other than their own subsistence. And he goes over this really fast. But I think it's very interesting. I think this might deserve, a book all by itself. The idea that the growth of capital being greater than the growth of income, which means that capital gets concentrated over time, which means that you have the rise of a small group of people who own everything, is to a large extent the very foundation of society itself. It is what allowed a class of owners to devote themselves to something other than their own subsistence. So so this is something that, I think Marx, the communists would have looked at and said, well, you have hunter-gatherer societies, and then you grow up and you end up with capitalist societies, and then the capitalist societies are concentrated in to few and fewer hands, and then they collapse, and you have communist societies rising out of them. And now we look back, and capitalist societies are evil and bad. Well, he's sort of suggesting, yeah, that may indeed be what happens with societies. And that doesn't mean capitalist societies are bad. This doesn't mean that a certain concentration of wealth is bad. We don't want the entire population of the planet to be subsistence farmers. We don't want the entire population of the planet to be hunter-gatherers. We don't want the entire population of the planet to have to work for their survival and work always and never stop working, right? We want a certain group of people who relax, take time to write books, to read books, to maybe take a year out of their lives and just talk to a camera, right? That this is something that is positive perhaps for society. This is how we get artists. This is how we have scientists. The first scientists were doing it for fun. We're doing it because they were curious. They weren't doing it for a job. Nobody paid the first scientists. They thought that the first scientists were people like Aristotle, who went around studying things, and eventually someone pays them to study things, and it becomes a job. So we have new jobs arising, and you have the expansion of the economy, and you have new possibilities being created. And now an artist is something that you can survive as. You don't have to be a hunter-gatherer because you're an artist. And the first artists aren't people who are scrounging for food in the dirt all the time. The first artists are folk who are resting in the cave, and they've got a few hours to themselves to draw with charcoal on the cave wall. That you don't have to work all the time. So this concentration of wealth does have outside effects, and some of them are probably negative, but some of them may be positive. And even some of them might be more complicated than that, right? So you have a concentration of capital, so you have the rise of nobles and priests and kings and whatnot. And for the peasants, that kind of sucks. But at the same time, would we have castles if we didn't have kings and princes? Would we have cannons and bugle calls? Would we have invented the stirrup if we didn't need it to hold knights as they charged with lances down the field of battle? Would we have blacksmiths if we didn't need swords, or we didn't need plows because we wanted to grow more from the land and so on, right? There's large, complex systems going on here. And especially in college, where I was recently, people have a tendency to look at a system and say it's bad or say it's good, when really it's complicated. And these systems, especially the ones we exist in today, have been around for a very long time. So we want to understand them and take the positives from them, not simply look at them and say capitalism is evil, or communism is evil, or bad, or never works. I'm like, well, there may be pieces of capitalism, communism, socialism, and whatnot that are positive and have good long-term effects that we would like to support. Just saying that, religion is bad. Well, religion is complicated. On one hand, you have the Crusades, which are bad, but then you have this interaction between the Middle East and Europe, which is good because it disseminates knowledge. But then you have, religious wars and death and terror, which is bad. But then you have people who take pride in, marching into the city of Jerusalem and capturing this city and raising up the steel, or sending out notices across the country. Look how great and proud we are. Or maybe you're defending yourself in Byzantium. And you're bad, it's bad, you're losing, it's being destroyed. But because it's destroyed, you have this dissemination of Western scholars coming from Byzantium to, in Germany and Russia, and spreading out knowledge, right? It's both bad and good. It's life, right? It's complicated. Okay, I say Byzantium, but I mean Constantinople. Today, Istanbul. Yeah. Okay. Okay, then he points this out again. Ultimately, we find that in the 20th century, both fiscal and non-fiscal shocks created a situation which, for the first time in history, the net return on capital was less than the growth rate. And this is something to look at here, something important. It says, for the first time in history. And we, especially in America, where because we grew differently than Europe, because we are the new world, we experience something different. When he talks about the first time in history, it means that the world we grew up in, the world you and I and our parents grew up in and grew their wealth in and bought their houses in and learned about history in, is, if not unique, very, very rare. We think it's normal because we grew up like this, but it's not. And I'm a millennial, and I think we tend to have a certain view on this, right? Which is, growing up, we heard about how the world is supposed to be, and the Soviet Union has fallen. The world is peaceful, the world is great, the economy is growing. And then it turns out we grow up, we exit high school, and we can't afford a house, and wages aren't keeping up with inflation, and food's always more expensive, and then, there's our parents are losing their houses because of the 2008 crash, and things just aren't seeming very great. Then you have COVID, and then you have now, when I remember when I could go to the Dollar Tree and get a can of beans for $1, and now I'm happy when it's $1.89. I remember when I thought I'd work for a company, and in 2 or 3 years get a promotion, be a manager, 2 or 3 years, move up. And then I meet friends of mine who have worked at a company for 15 years and moved nowhere and got nothing and still making minimum wage. And I go, that's not how life is supposed to work. So we see at least my generation sees a changing world. We hear what our parents are saying, and it's not jiving with what we see. We hear what our grandparents are saying about their lives and their existence and their history, and we're going, that's not what I feel the future holds for me. It's not in the sense of the 70s and the hippies. The world should be better, and the world's changing, and I don't know, drugs and LSD are going to open our eyes. It's more as in the world's getting worse, things are getting more expensive, and the world is becoming more dangerous, more full of wars. Politics is getting more partisan. All these problems are arising, and I'm going, well, what's happening here? Why does the American dream seem to be fading? Or what do you feel that it's fading? And he's saying, well, partially it's because the greatest generation, the boomers, grew up in a world which is unlike the world in the 1900s and the 1800s and the 1700s and the 1600s and the 1400s and the 1200s and the 800s. It's very different. You have this massive growth in population, this massive growth in technology, which the world, which humanity has never before seen. And now we seem to be slowing down again. Now we seem to be concentrating our capital again. Now we start to go backwards is what he's warning of here, right? It's what he's worried about, because we don't want to go back to the 1900s. We don't want to go back to merry old England, and yay, King George the Third. It's, for the vast majority of folk, it's not something we like. And I think people might react to that differently, and sometimes they're going to say, hey, I'm going to be rich, I'm going to make it, I'm going to be one of the people on top. And I would like a world where the people on top stay on top. I would like a world where the people on top aren't taxed very heavily, where the people on top are not in danger of losing their investments, where the people on top have lots of freedom to own guns and hunt and say whatever they want. When the people on top are able to protect their houses and their families. Because I'm going to be one of those people on top. I'm part of the middle class, right? And I'm going upwards. And he's sort of saying here, he's saying that may not last for long. That might not be the case. And most people are not going to be up at the top. If you end up having a stratification of society where the middle class gets squeezed out of existence, then those people go somewhere. And the bottom 50% is a whole lot bigger than the top 10%. Like, what sort of world do you want to live in? What sort of chances do you want to take? And and you can look at certain eras and see how that works out. You can look at the 1850s and go, am I likely to be a robber baron? If not, how did someone of my skills, my level in society, exist in the 1850s? And is that a life I would want to have? And most notably, the 1850s in Europe. Because he does make this distinction that the 1850s in the United States, you could theoretically still go off into the woods and build a cabin. But in Europe, you couldn't do that because everything was owned by somebody. So we're not going back to the Wild West. We're going back to the days of the Kaiser. And whether that is the Kaiser and there's a king and nobles, or whether it's a sort of cyberpunkish capitalist utopia where everything is owned by a company and the companies are owned by two people. It's not necessarily, the moral and ethical and spiritual and theoretical basis for who rules us and how. It is a matter of ownership, matter of property, matter of control, and whether that control is in a few hands or many hands, however it's justified. Okay, and he says, as noted, such an inegalitarian spiral cannot continue indefinitely. Ultimately, there will be no place to invest the savings, and the global return on capital will fall until an equilibrium distribution emerges. But that can take a very long time, and since the top centile share of Parisian wealth is 1913 already exceeded 70%, it is legitimate to ask how high the equilibrium level would have been had the shocks due to World War I not occurred. Okay, so what I sort of saying here is, when I say, a few people own everything, I mean a few people own everything. Is the possible world we might be entering in the next 50 or 100 years. And he's saying, the top 70%, the top 10% of Parisian wealth in 1913 already exceeded 70%. So 10% of people own 70% 1% of all wealth. And later in other places, you're talking about like medieval England, it would have been more like 90%. And that is something that is sustainable. Like what's the limit? How few does it end with one person owning everything? And he's saying, well, probably not. It's very unlikely that one person owns everything, but you're going to have, I'm making up the numbers here, but 500 families. What have there been? 2,000 families in England of the rich and well off, and 20,000 families maybe in a 25 million population. I'm making those numbers up, but that's the sort of levels we're talking about here. Where, I've talked to people in Russia like, oh yeah, I can name the oligarchs. There's like 30 of them, and each one of them is in this section, and I know their names, and I know sort of their histories, and they're famous, and maybe there are stories and ideas written about them, and it's not just so and so from middle of nowhere. It's so and so of the great family, so and so of the famous great grandparent sort of bit. So that's a possible world we won't be living in again. Okay, so here is 373. What structural changes occurred between 1914 and 1955? He says, the most natural and important explanation is that governments in the 20th century began taxing capital and income at significant rates. So he makes an example here of like the inheritance tax was 1% maybe in some countries. And the tax on capital was 0%. You paid almost nothing to the government for gains on capital in the earlier in the millennium. Right. In the 20th century, taxes of various kinds were imposed on dividends, interest, profits, and rents. This changed things radically. An average tax rate of 30% reduces a pre-tax return of 5% to a net return of 3.5% after taxes. This in itself is enough to have significant long-term effects. So he's saying, look, you had this capital shock, 1913 to 1915, and then we raised taxes and taxed things like dividends, interest, profits, rent. And this lowered the return on capital, which meant that we had a more equitable distribution of wealth across the nation. But as we change and we lower taxes on capital, we lower taxes on dividends, we lower taxes on capital gains, we give tax breaks for this or that and so on. We lower inheritance taxes, we lower the cost of having multiple houses and so on. As we say, the top 10% of income earners in the United States actually pay a smaller percentage of their income in taxes than the bottom 20% of people pay in taxes, sort of idea. We reverse that situation when we help capital grow. So, what is it? It's famously something like the United States at one point had a progressive tax system, and the top percentage was like 90%. And this wasn't, if you made $1.5 million, you paid 9% of your wealth, of your income in taxes. This was, if you made $1.5 million, on the last 100,000, you paid 90%. And then on the on the 200,000 before that, you paid 80%. On the 200,000 before that, you paid 70%, and so on until, hey, if you made $200,000, you paid 5%. That's how progressive taxes work, where the more money you make, the more you pay on that additional percentage, that additional level of income only. which is important, right? If we 90% taxes, oh my gosh, 90% of my money to the government. No. 90% of the last $1.5 million you made, and you made $7 million that year, sort of level, right? But as we reverse that, if we add things like flat taxes, those help capital because a flat tax affects everybody. You have to at least have tax breaks for the lowest percentage, which becomes a progressive tax essentially. Like the more you make, the more you pay. And as we reduce those progressive taxes, we help return to the days of the kings and the nobles. Like what is the means for resisting a day to a return to the kings and the nobles? Tax them. Tax the rich before they become rich. Tax them when they are merely well off. Make it difficult to gain a fortune of $400 billion. Make it incredibly difficult to do so. And we are not doing that because we dislike people becoming rich. We're not doing that because we dislike capitalists or we want to lower growth. No, we're doing that because it causes structural damage to the way our society runs. We want a certain level of equality of income and wages to persist in our country because we do not want to go back to the days of George III. But that gets more into the solutions, and I think he talks about solutions in part 4. We're only in part 3. Oh my gosh, how many? Okay, I'm going to start skipping some of these. My throat is hurting. Oh, for all the cohorts between 1910 and 1960, the top centile of the income hierarchy consisted largely of people whose primary sources of income were work. And for the cohort born in the 1970s and even more for those born later, things are quite different. Basically, our grandparents, growing up in 1945 to 1970, lived in a world where if you worked hard, you could make more money than someone who merely inherited their wealth. But about 1970, that started to change. You were more likely, after 1970, he says, if you were rich, you were more likely to inherit those riches than you were to build those riches over your lifetime. It basically is saying there was a certain world where the economic realities were such that working hard can make you rich, and there was a very good chance of that. But since the 1970s, that has changed, and the world has become such that it is more and more difficult to work hard and become rich because you worked hard. It is much more likely today that you work hard and you get a mortgage on a house and you buy that house and you own that house, and then you inherit a second house from your parents and your wealth doubles overnight. Everything you worked for your entire life of income and investment can double because someone died and you inherited that work. And that's more likely to happen today than it was in the 1970s because capital was destroyed in the 1945. So inheritance were a smaller percentage of all wealth. Basically, he's pointing out again that the world we live in is different, economically speaking, than the world our parents and grandparents lived in or grew up in or went to work in. And he's not saying, this isn't anecdotal. He's like, there are actual numbers and studies and proofs here that inequality has risen. And it's risen in a certain way. And happening at certain years. And then he talks about, it is interesting, moreover, to note that the most ardent meritocratic beliefs are often justified It is interesting, moreover, to note that the most ardent meritocratic beliefs are often invoked to justify very large wage inequalities, which are said to be more justified than inequalities due to inheritance. Basically, if you grow up in a world where working hard was a more sure path to becoming rich, then you are going to think today that the richest people worked the hardest. Okay? But if you grew up in a world where inheritance and capital gains over the course of decades that your ancestors made matter more to your wealth than how hard you worked, then you are likely to believe the opposite. You are likely to believe that if someone is rich, it is because they are a Nepo baby of some sort or another. And so you have these generational fights and so on. And we live in a time period where, you have people living to 100, large numbers of people living to 100. So the economic realities of 85 years ago, during their formative years, affect how they think the world works today. Whereas the people who are growing up, 25, 35 today, live in a world of different economic realities. And so we see or think or expect different things to happen. We view the world differently because of how we think the world is going to work or going to turn out. Like what matters in the end as regards being rich or being able to retire. Am I going to rely on Social Security? Well, I know people, my friends of mine, who Social Security is their retirement plan. There is no saving. There is no buying a house. There is renting an apartment and working, 50 hours a week at 2 different jobs. And maybe they're thinking when they're 65, they can retire on Social Security because that's their only hope. They aren't investing a damn dime. And I know people like this. That's the life they expect. That they're going to work hard and work hard and work hard and just not be able to grow wealth. And there are many explanations for that. The people I know who do that generally either have like family they take care of or very bad financial sense. Is that, hey, you could afford to save a few dollars, but you're not going to, sort of issue. And so I would definitely see that, or I definitely think that financial literacy and lessons in investment or how just straight up compound interest works are very good to teach at a younger age, right? Because you want to instill these ideas, because partially it's the world they grew up in it's actually more difficult to work a regular job and grow wealth, but partially they expect it to be that way. So they don't act to change it. They're like, well, I'm never going to be rich no matter how hard I work. So why would I work extra hard? And it's saying, well, yes and no, right? You are not likely to become rich because you worked extra hard, but you'll never become rich if you don't work extra hard. And that can be a hard lesson to impart. But you can also give up, right? If you were 35 and you worked hard all your life and you're just not seeing the returns you wanted to see, you may just give up, right? And that's what happens on a societal level. You see more and more people going, I see what my grandparents and parents said, and I sort of did it, but it's just not working for me. Like I'm not at my age, I'm not where my parents were when they were my age. And this happened, and a lot of people I know are sort of experiencing that. They live in a different world and they're going, it's not just me, it's something else. And there are lessons to be learned from the past, but also we live in the present, which is not the past. And that's very difficult for people who were born in the past sometimes to understand. That now is not then. But this can also be more complicated, because we have to interpret that too. Let's say, and so on, imply that there are far fewer very large estates today than there were in the 19th century. He's saying that in the 19th century, you had nobles and princes who owned castles, and when if a noble owned a castle, he didn't own a castle. He owned the castle and everything he could see. He owned the castle and the land and the peasants and the cows the peasants used to pull the oxen the peasants used to pull the plow, and he owned the bank that you would have to borrow money from if you wanted to start a business, right? The large estates were huge estates. And there are fewer of those today. Today, you're more likely to have someone who's just sort of, got $2-3 million worth of investments, owns their own house, owns their own car, maybe owns their own business, sort of thing. Right? Like these smaller estates are more prevalent. So you have people who are part of the 10%, but also not part of the 0.001%. The 10% has gotten bigger over time compared to how it was in the 19th century, the 18th century, the 17th century. So the world we're entering may not be exactly like it was in the 19th century, right? We may not enter the era of nobles and kings and robber barons. We may enter an era that looks very different, where there's still a concentration of capital, but the capital concentration is spread out, or the method of ownership is more abstract. And instead of owning, a castle and guards, you own stock in 5 or 6 different companies. You own a piece of a percentage of an abstract idea, or you own an IP versus you own ships and swords and houses and land and so on, right? So he's talking about a concentration of capital, but we go back to the beginning of the chapter, right? We're saying you lose a lot of nuance there, right? Tomorrow does not have to be yesterday. Is sort of what he's saying. The past doesn't have to determine the future exactly. He's talking about general trends. He's talking about what seems to be happening. He's talking about his best guess, looking at things in a smaller number of dimensions than actually exists. So you lose some information, but you lose definition, but you gain clarity, is what he's saying. Okay. And as a result of this, it is more difficult to represent artistically or to correct politically, because it is a commonplace inequality opposing broad segments of the population rather than pitting a small elite against the rest of society. We have moved from a society with a small number of very wealthy rentiers to one with a much larger number of less wealthy rentiers, a society of petites rentiers, if you will. And that's what he was saying before, right? You have fewer people who... there's lots of folk who own 1 or 2 houses that they rent out to a few tenants. Whereas, so we go out to the 18th century, if you owned a house to rent to somebody, you owned 5 or 6 or a dozen houses to rent to somebody. Versus today, you might own 2 or 3. We have smaller landlords. And that means that wealth is more distributed. So, even as we talk about the concentration of wealth, it may be distributed in a different way. It may be distributed among, like if you own stock in 7 or 8 or a dozen companies, then it becomes harder to criticize you for the actions, because you're saying, hey, I don't control Nestle Toll House. I don't control Tesla. I don't control Ford. I own 3% of their stock. I am not the ruler. And now it's harder to criticize you. Well, I'm saying, all the 85 people who together own all the stock in this company are at fault for what the company does, as opposed to the king or the duke, and it's more difficult to criticize people that are in, it's more difficult to criticize a group for acting rationally than it is to criticize an individual person for how they act, which may change how we respond, right? Because we don't want to attack somebody who hasn't done anything wrong. If so-and-so has inherited $5 million from a distant cousin, that doesn't mean that he's responsible for everything the distant cousin did. That doesn't mean that he's done something wrong. That doesn't mean that someone who has received benefits from their parents has made a mistake or has acted evil or has even taken advantage of the world. They're just getting along. They're just surviving. Now they're doing things, they're doing what they can to the best of their ability. And so when we criticize, we want to have this nuance, but as we gain nuance, we lose definition, right? It becomes harder to say where the problem lies if it's a company than if it's an individual. We can point at the president, for example, and say he's making mistakes, but it's much more difficult to point at the Department of Education and say, well, they've made mistakes. Well, who is they, right? And what's the time period we're talking about? They've made mistakes over the last 30 years is a much gentler attack than so-and-so who was in charge of the department made this decision on this day, and it was a bad decision, and it led to this effect, which was horrible, right? I mean, the level of attack is much more complicated in that situation. It becomes easier to defend yourself as well, right? Oh, I'm not doing anything wrong. I don't control anything. I just have bits and pieces, and then we start talking about structural inequality, and well, you are benefiting from a structural inequality in the way the world is set up, and I go, hey, I didn't do that. It's not my fault. And you know what? I agree with you. We should change things. Let's pass a few laws and gently massage the way the future works. But I don't want a communist overthrow and chop off all their heads, all the French Revolution. There's a gentle movements that want to be made. It's as wealth is distributed more evenly, and if we want to change how wealth is generated or taxed, then we move slower than if wealth is concentrated, right? If 5 people own everything, then all you have to do is attack those 5 people. If 500,000 people own everything, how do you attack every one of them? Right? You end up attacking the class system itself. And when you attack the system itself, then you end up attacking everyone who benefits from the system. And it's not all of a sudden, it's not the 500,000 people who own everything. You're also fighting against the 2 million people just under them who own something. And maybe you end up fighting against the 30 million people under that who see the poor and destitute and homeless and go, I don't want to become that. And if you upset the system, I'm going to become that. Right? And now all of a sudden, instead of attacking 500,000 people, you're dealing with 30 million people saying, whoa, stop, slow down, that's a bad idea, changing the system. Right? Because people are invested in a system, whether or not it is the best possible system. It's a system that exists right now. And I don't have to benefit disproportionately from that to worry about its destruction, because I can see how bad things could get. Okay. Okay, it basically points out here that large wealth grows faster. If $50 billion doubles in 30 years, it becomes $100 billion. If my $10,000 doubles in 30 years, it becomes $20,000. And if it doubles again in 30 more years, then by the time I'm 60, my $10,000 IRA is worth $30,000, right? But on the other hand, if somebody started with $50 billion and it doubles and then doubles again, then by the time they're 60, their $50 billion is worth $400 billion, which is their 50 is $200 billion, would be worth $200 billion if it doubled and then doubled again in 30 years. Yeah. And we're making the same percentages, but we aren't making the same money, and we are not making the same percentages of wealth or percentages of cash money within the system. Is, I believe, what he's saying and how that works. But he also talks about like the rate grows faster and faster. He has a little study of university endowments, and he's like, look, if your university endowment is like $100 million, then you end up, I don't remember the exact numbers, right? Then your returns are like 7%. But if your university endowment is $30 billion, then your returns are 11%, right? So maybe I have $10,000 and it doubles to $20,000, and then it doubles again to 30 and becomes $40,000. But $50 billion guy, his doubles and he doesn't get my returns, right? It doubles in 8 years. Mine doubles in 10 years. So 16 years from now, mine is has doubled and then like 1.6. It's 160% bigger, where his is 200% bigger. And 60 years from now, mine is doubled or quadrupled. Mine is quadrupled, and it's worth $40,000. But his $50 billion has, because of the difference between 7 and 11% returns, has quintupled or something, right? And he's making he has $500 billion now. He got greater returns because he had a greater amount of capital to start with. Which is why capital concentrates over time, right? Yeah, that's a better example. Because if we each grow at the same rate, then the money supply stays the same. But if they grow at a higher rate than me, then part of the money supply creation is captured by them. Yeah. Yeah, I think it is more useful to try to understand the general laws that govern the dynamics of wealth, rather than indulging in a moral hierarchy of wealth, right? You don't have to say, I can say rich people are good and point at Bill Gates giving away a bunch of his money. I can say that rich people are bad and point at Elon Musk interfering in politics. But that's different. That what I'm doing in that case is talking about individuals and how they act. But if I want to say wealth concentration is bad, then I'm talking about a class, a group of people. And that can be more useful, especially as it becomes taxes, right? Because you don't want to be like, well, we're going to tax, Bill Gates is the richest man in the world, so we're going to tax him higher than everybody else, right? It's just targeting somebody. That's morally reprehensible. That's unequal based on the fact that you don't like the person or what they do or their political views. But if you say, we're going to tax everybody who makes more than $1 million this year, and Bill Gates just happens to be one of those people, then that is a more equitable critique of the situation. That's a more moral action. That's one you can justify without just straight up saying, I hate so-and-so, or I disagree with so-and-so and whatnot. But, perversely, that can go the other way, right? So, if you say, well, we're going to give this person and his company, specifically the company that he owns, a few government contracts because we like him, because he gave money to our campaign, then that is also morally reprehensible, right? You want to be like, well, we want to help the electric car industry, so we're going to give all these, 4 or 5 companies, government contracts for electronic cars, instead of just the one company of the guy we like. That's also a problem. So again, he's basically he's basically talking about that you want to talk about, classes and groups instead of individuals when you're deciding what to do and how money and economics works, or it should be criticized. Oh, and this part I found very interesting. Okay. The higher we go in the endowment hierarchy, the more often we find alternative investment strategies. That is, very high yield investments such as shares in private equity funds and unlisted foreign stocks, hedge funds, derivatives, real estate, and raw materials. These require great expertise, energy, natural resources, related products, which require specialized expertise and offer very high potential yields. If we consider the importance in these various portfolios of alternative investments, whose only common feature is that they abandon the usual strategies of investing in stocks and bonds acceptable to all, we find they represent 10% of the portfolios of institutions with endowments of less than 50 million euros, 25% of those with endowments between 50 and 100 million euros, 35% of those between 100 and 500 million euros, 45% of those between 500 million and a billion euros, and ultimately more than 60% of those above 1 billion euros. Basically, what he's saying here on page 449 is that if you are rich enough, you gain access to information which the common person does not have. You gain access to investments. You gain access to knowledge and abilities that the average person does not have and cannot invest in. Right? The average person is investing in the public stock market, but you have private endowments, of $50 billion who are investing in private companies, who are investing in mines, who are creating factories, who are buying up real estate. The average person it finds it difficult to invest in housing, for example. Like, well, I think the real estate market is going up, so I'm going to buy a bunch of houses. The average person doesn't do that. But if you're rich enough, you can. You can say, I can afford to jump $400 million this year buying actual physical real estate and watching it go up. I don't have to buy shares in a company that then buys real estate. I don't have to buy, some complicated financial instrument that is linked to the growth of the housing market. I don't have to buy, stocks in these construction companies who I think will benefit from the growth of housing. You can just straight up buy a house, and you can buy houses in the hundreds because you have this extra money to invest wherever you want. And the regular person does not have access to that, or has limited access, or or indirect access. What they mentioned, private equity funds and unlisted foreign stocks. I mean, how creepy is that, right? Real raw materials, right? Hey, if you have the money to buy a bunch of oil and store it in barrels somewhere for 3 years until the oil price goes up, or 3 months or whatever, then you can make a whole lot of money doing that. And the average person can buy shares in a company which does that, but maybe the company makes a mistake, right? Maybe the company runs into a financial problem, and the average person can't control that, can't affect that. But a large endowment, right, who has $50 billion, for example, can just straight up say, I'm going to make a bet that the oil price is going to go up, so I'm going to buy oil futures, by the hundreds right now. And my examples may suck. Someone with much more knowledge about how these things work may point out that what I said doesn't make any sense, but that doesn't mean that the central idea isn't there in some way. And according to this guy who has studied this, right, he's saying, hey, there actually are secrets that the very rich know that you don't. There's a way to get higher investments. He talks about, that they can afford to hire the best people, and they can afford to get more information. Like if you can spend $100 million just sort of buying up economic information, you can probably make a whole lot of money off of that. But if I'm at home and I'm working off of news reports that are old by the time they get to me, that have already been reported in wires through routers, 2 hours ago, and someone has direct access to that and benefits off of it 2 hours before I have the possibility of benefiting off of it, because I can't afford the $400 or whatever for a subscription to such and such information service. Then because you have more money to spend, you actually have a bigger return. These returns, he says, are focused on higher endowments, on higher and more concentrated levels of capital. Okay. He mentions that inflation forces people to pay some attention to their capital. So I thought that was interesting. That inflation is good. We generally think that inflation is good because, at least this is what the idea I've gotten after reading this book, that inflation is good because it forces capital to move. It forces capital to activate. It forces capital to you can't just own a castle. You got to do something with owning that castle, because the castle is slowly falling apart. You have to maintain it. You have to invest in it. It doesn't stay the same. Whereas if you buy a bar of gold, you can bury that bar of gold in the ground and do nothing to it except own it. And, its value stays the same or goes up according to what other people do. But you don't have to work on it. But if inflation is going up, then if you have money, you can't just keep that money. You can't just take $100 million, put it in a bank account, and forget about it for the next 50 years. You're going to lose a whole lot of wealth and value. I have a relative who takes all his money from his paychecks, puts it in a checking account, and it sits there, and it sits there, and it sits there. And hey, yeah, he's got a lot of money, but the value of that money, the purchasing power, the spending power of that money is going down and down and down every year. So if you don't invest it in something, you're going to have problems. So inflation says, move your money, do something with it. Because the way the economy works is you want money to move. You want cash to flow back and forth. I gain money, I spend money. I gain money, I spend money. And as long as everybody does this, the entire system can equalize itself. If there's a slowdown in one part of the economy, then money can move to a different part of the economy, and money can unclog the gaps. If I am a store and I usually get my supplies from one area or from one other company, and that company has a problem, well, then I can use my money and get my supplies from a different company. Whereas if I take my money and I buy stock in a company, and then that company that I bought stock in has problems, so they aren't sending me supplies, I can't move them around because I own stock and not money. Right? The money is fungible and movable, and you want it to flow back and forth. And inflation pushes money to flow around and move from person to person and place to place. But money is only one type of capital. Right? If you own a house, then you have an asset price. And the asset price, he says, some people think that inflation reduces the average return on capital. This is false because the average asset price tends to rise the same price as consumer prices. If I own stock in a grocery store, then as grocery prices go up, I gain money. So I may be paying $5 for a can of tomatoes, but I'm also getting a higher return because of inflation if I own stock in the company that is selling those tomatoes. So it evens out. So inflation does help do something, right? It means people have to pay attention to their capital. It means that people can't just hold a pile of money and do nothing with it. But inflation by itself is not enough. It is not enough to equalize things. Inflation by itself does not mean that if you are rich, you will lose all your money. It just means that if you are rich, you have to move your money to places that can beat where the return on where the return is equal to or better than inflation. And this is something he points out also, that in 1910 there were people who lived in a world without inflation. They grew up in a world where inflation was essentially zero, and they were a great landowner. They took rent in, and then inflation hit and they didn't change. They were still living in the world of their childhood in 1910, in 1920 and 1930, when the Great Depression is going on, and you still think, hey, I get a 5% return on my capital or whatnot, and this is a certain lifestyle I am able to keep with that money, and I don't want to give up that lifestyle. So I'm going to start selling some of my land to maintain a lifestyle which I am accustomed to. And emotionally, I've accepted that I can keep this going forever, because that's how it was for my grandparents, and that's how it was for my first 30 or 40 years of life. But now you're in a time with high inflation. You're in a different economic world, a different economic reality. And if you don't change, you'll lose. And he's basically saying that's what happened to quite a lot of people in 1913, 1945. Not only was there this destruction of capital, literal destruction of capital, as in buildings falling down and companies becoming nationalized by new countries, but also there was this reluctance to shift, to change, to realize that you can't just be a great landowner anymore. You need to be an investor, because you have to beat inflation. Right? So by making money move, it pushes you around. But inflation by itself is not purely going to distribute capital. What it may do, possibly, as I would argue, right, is make the accumulation of capital more meritocratic. People who can game the system better, who can deal with a world of inflation, and who can, because if money has to move in order to be maintained, and the person who can move their money, or the person who can, at the very least, maintain their assets best, or maintain their assets for a lower price than other people maintain their assets for of the same kind, right? Then they should be able to accumulate capital over time more and more and more. But the level of effect that has is probably questionable, and I would say probably is kind of low. But it's something to point out, that inflation has these effects which are negative. Yeah, it costs me more, but also positive in some way. But also, inflation says, hey, you, the minimum wage worker who doesn't own anything, you're just going to suffer. Whereas the middle class person who is also doesn't make a whole lot of money, but at least owns their house, hey, inflation goes up, but so does my house value. So I'm not suffering all that much. And as for the great industrialist who sells a lot of things, inflation goes up, and I have to charge people more, but that's not hurting my bottom line very much. It's hurting it's just bad for them. Until it gets to a certain level, when things get overbalanced and you have hyperinflation, and all of a sudden I can't sell as many cars. And inflation may also cause effects like competition. It may squeeze competition a little bit, in the sense that I can't last as long against my neighbor. And if he can eke out an extra 0.2% growth than me, then that may be enough to push him over inflation. and so they gain more money. Or if inflation is growing and it turns out that it costs me more to maintain my factory than it does for my competitor to maintain his factory, then I may be in trouble because of inflation. And so I would say inflation has a slightly meritocratic effect upon owners, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't. Okay, but that just because it has an effect, capital, the effect of the tendency for capital to become concentrated still happens, I think is what he's saying, even if inflation goes on. So he's getting into the answers now, right? But he's basically saying, we want this slight level of inflation, and we want to have progressive taxes on large capital collections, large centers of capital. Okay. Yeah, inflation, progressive tax. Okay, sorry. Okay, and then finally he ends this section by talking about sort of some of the hidden realities he suspects wealth seems to have, right? The hidden effects and ideas that are going on. All right, so Saudi Arabia, he points out, Saudi funds seem to be invested much less aggressively. According to official documents, the average return on a Saudi sovereign wealth fund was no more than 2 to 3%, mainly because much of the money was invested in U.S. Treasury bonds. Right? So he's saying the Saudis, for example, could take their money and invest it and get 5, 10, 15% returns that they put it in the stock market. Instead, they're putting it in U.S. Treasury bonds. And there is an argument that you put it in U.S. Treasury bonds because that's a safe investment and it grows slowly at 2 to 3% instead of 5 or 8%. But it is a decision. And why do you make those decisions? Maybe it's for safety, but it also says, even though it is never stated explicitly, it is not illogical for Saudi Arabia to lend at low interest to the country that protects it militarily. So if you're going to, so a government bond, buying a U.S. government bond is loaning the government money. You're loaning the U.S. government money. And so maybe you have a country, buying U.S. government bonds, which is essentially loaning the U.S. government money at a certain, at a lower rate than they might get on the open market. Is saying, hey, you owe us a lot of money, so maybe you should protect us, because if you don't protect us, we might call in those bonds, we might call in those debts, so we might stop buying new debt because the U.S. keeps borrowing more and more money, and we keep giving it more and more money, so either protect us or you won't be able to borrow anymore, and then you have all sorts of problems internally, and you can't maintain your level of social activity, and you can't maintain your defenses and so on. So this is something like, it may not be malicious, it just might be something like, hey, we want the U.S. to maintain a large military because they use it to defend us, so instead of paying for our own military, we're going to lend money to the U.S. government. And if you lend money to the U.S. government at 2%, and then inflation is 3%, then you're actually losing money during that time period, which is an interesting decision to make. But again, those are very safe grows, safe investments. So that's something to also do. There's lots of complexities and angles going on here. But it is a question when you think about how governments give money back and forth to each other. But he also takes later aim at the idea. He said, he basically points out that the U.S. and Europe are really wealthy, like super incredibly wealthy. It's hard for people to understand that Europe, the European households own 20 times as much capital as China. The idea of this is rather hard to grasp, especially since this wealth is private and cannot be mobilized with governments for public purposes such as aiding Greece and so on. Okay, so he's talking about the idea that hey, Chinese companies are buying up real estate, and soon they're going to own all the real estate in my country. And he's saying that this is irrational. The Bank of China owns 3 trillion euros in Europe of household debt. But European households own 70 trillion euros. So the Bank of China is 1/20th of the problem of great landowners owning all the wealth. And he says, this holds true for most countries. Most countries, you're going to own a bit of separate countries. I'm going to own a bit of Chinese real estate. China's going to own a bit of U.S. real estate. U.S. is going to own a bit of the Italian real estate. Italy is going to own a little bit of the French real estate, and so on. And he basically says that these amounts are very small. But why is there so much worry? Well, part of the reason we have these panic attacks that, oh my gosh, China is buying up all our stuff, is buying up all our factories, is buying all our businesses, is part of the reason is no doubt the universal tendency to look elsewhere for the source of domestic difficulties. For example, many people in France believe that rich foreign buyers are responsible for the skyrocketing price of purist real estate. When one looks closely at who is buying what type of apartment, however, one finds that the increase in the number of foreign buyers can explain barely 3% of the price increase. In other words, 97% of today's very high real estate prices are due to the fact that there are enough French buyers residing in France who are prosperous enough to pay such large amounts for property. To my mind, this feeling of dispossession is due primarily to the fact that wealth is very highly concentrated in the rich countries. And that's right. That's what he's saying, right? That hearing about China buying up a bunch of houses in the U.S. is a small piece of a pie. It's an easy target for the real people who are buying up houses to point out. It's something that you can whip up fervor about in the news, but has in Paris, has a 3% actual effect. It's like, why are housing prices going up? Well, housing prices are going up because, these rich companies keep buying houses and renting them out. Well, also housing prices are going up because we don't have new construction, because we passed zoning laws, because it takes forever to get a permit, because we raised tariffs on Canadian lumber, and now it's more lumber to buy for a house is more expensive, so it's more expensive to build houses, so we're building less houses, and it's so the houses where the lumber is already installed the price goes up. For repairs or something, the price goes up, and so on. They're complicated situations, but he says over and over again, in many ways in in this book, that countries today, for the most part, own themselves. And if we have problems with the economy in a country, it is easy to blame foreign groups, but the real problems are much more likely to be within the country itself. Real problems are much more likely to be choices that we have made as a country, as a people, that are now coming back to haunt us. And we're blaming, Miss so-and-so in country XYZ is a quick and easy and dirty and wrong solution to the problem. And he's saying, well, how do we know this? We know this because foreigners own a very small percentage of the U.S., for example. or Paris. Mostly it's Parisians, or mostly it's people in the United States that own the US. It's companies that work here, that exist here, that would be very happy for someone else to be mentioned in the news as a problem or an issue. And finally, this last bit I thought was very interesting. Okay. Another point that needs to be emphasized is that a substantial fraction of global financial assets is already hidden away in various tax havens, thus limiting our ability to analyze a geographic distribution of global wealth. Okay. To judge by official statistics alone, it would seem the net asset position of the wealthy countries vis-a-vis the rest of the world is negative. Basically, looking at official statistics, the rich world owes the poor world a lot of money because the poor world has bought a lot of rich world debt. So let's say the US looks like China, for example, or Nairobi, or Qatar, or Spain, or whatever country it is that we sell our debt to. It looks like we owe a lot of money to somebody. In fact, we owe more money than we have. All told, when one adds up the positions of all the wealthy countries, one is left with a slightly negative position, equivalent to about negative 4% of global GDP in 2010. It is important to recognize, however, that it is a very slightly negative position, 1% of global wealth. Essentially, the U.S., on average, you would say, the U.S. and Europe and Japan, we put them together, they owe more money than they have. They owe more money than their assets are worth. They're upside down on their house of the country. And of course, this slightly negative official position should in principle be counterbalanced by an equivalent positive position for the rest of the world, right? If I borrow money, then someone owns that debt. If I borrow $100 from somebody, then someone out there says, you owe me $100. Right? So there is always a counterpoint to every exchange of debt. Every financial movement has at least two parties involved in this situation. So it's like basic accounting. Everything adds up to zero at the end. Everything has to balance. Debts and credits have to balance. And this is a piece of mathematical reality. So what's he saying? If you borrow money from somebody, then you owe that money to somebody. But so if the rich countries are at negative 4%, they owe 4% of their GDP to somebody, 4% of whatever the amount is, then the poor countries should have plus 4%. They should have 4% of that debt should be given to them, right? They own it. They have it. However, in fact, this is not the case. Okay, so in other words, the poor countries should own more assets than the rich countries than vice versa. Nairobi should own more of the U.S. than the U.S. owns of Nairobi. To give a very probably wrong example, but who knows. With a surplus on the order of 4% of global GDP in their favor. In fact, this is not the case. If one adds up the financial statistics for the various countries of the world, one finds that the poor countries also have a negative position, and that the world as a whole is in a substantially negative position. It seems, in other words, that Earth must be owned by Mars. Right? He's basically saying, look, if you look at governments, if you look at economies and ask, do they owe people money? Then you find that every economy owes people money. On average, that every economy in the world owes somebody money. It owes that money to a different economy. That's not possible. Right? The entire world cannot all be in debt at the same time. If you borrow money, you borrow it from somebody. What he's saying. But if we look at this, what happens, right? Well, it means that money is hidden somewhere. It means that money is being squirreled away and taken and placed in places where we don't know what it is. We don't know where it is. We can't count it. We can't find it. But someone has that wealth. Someone owns something. It's like the crack house down the street. Somebody owns that house. It may be very difficult to find out who owns that house. The records may be confused. No one would be maybe willing to come forward and say they own the house. And if I want to buy the house, I'm going to look at, well, the house is owned by, so and so on this record, but so and so on this record, or the house is owned by a company which is also a subsidiary of this, which is a subsidiary of this, which is a subsidiary of a third country, of a company that's in a third country, but that company in a third country is a subsidiary of a U.S. company. So it's a U.S. company that owns it, but it's like unclear the ownership structure that's going on here. And, it may be very difficult to find out who owns the crack house down the street. And no one is willing to come forward. No one's going to say, I am proud to own this dump. But somebody does. And somebody or some group or some people in the world, he's basically saying, are hiding money in this way. He references someone called someone who did a study, who was able to show that the most plausible reason for the discrepancy is that large amounts of unreported financial assets are held in tax havens. By his cautious estimate, these amount to nearly 10% of global GDP. So 10% of global GDP isn't even mentioned in official statistics, is basically what he's saying. So there's somebody, maybe many somebodies, many companies most likely, who take their money and park it in, I don't know, Trinidad or Cuba or somewhere that doesn't report what's going on, parks it in a secret Swiss bank account, that has $100 billion just sitting there. And it looks like we aren't owning anything, or they have their company is registered in Ireland, and they have 15 branches all over the world. And some of these branches are in areas where the government doesn't ask very probing questions about taxes. And the company also has, owns buildings through subsidiaries and has bars of gold sitting in their basement, and has a secret bank account on some Caribbean island with $45 million in it. And meanwhile, the company in Ireland is reporting that they don't have that $45 million. And hey, if you want to go to our subsidiary in whatchamacallit, middle of nowhere, and ask questions, you can try. But I'm telling you, my subsidiary only made $20 million last year. I don't know where these reports of my subsidiary making $65 million comes from. You hide the money in some way. And when you do that over and over and over and over and over again with large groups of people and all across the world, he's basically saying, hey, we have actual studies that show world GDP, world creation of wealth is captured by groups of people who, are rich enough to do so. On an individual level, we might think of this something like, my uncle bought gold coins on the black market in the 1980s. And then when he died, those were passed on to me. And I just didn't mention that to anybody. It was like, it was a box of gold coins he had under his bed. And the records were lost. He didn't claim it on his taxes. The gold coins were stolen from someplace in 1977, or the gold was mined by miners who snuck onto a gold claim in South Africa, right? And there's no official statistic that money was made, and nobody knows what's happening here. And I'm sure as hell not telling the government that I inherited, $300,000 worth of gold that nobody knows about and nobody has seen, and that, my uncle died penniless or something, right? He owned nothing except a few scraps of clothing and some pictures. Also this box of gold coins, but I'm not asking about that. That's how you hide money on a personal level. And if you do that for $45 million, if you do that for 10% of world GDP, it's not just gold coins under uncle's bed. It is much more complicated. And it requires money to be complicated. It requires lawyers. It requires moving cash between countries. It requires ingenuity. And, he's saying, there's this inequality of wealth, and capital concentrates over time, but also capital, when it gets big enough, does interesting things. The really large fortunes grow faster than small fortunes. The really large fortunes can hide money in ways that regular folk can't even imagine. The really large fortunes have this tendency to become so concentrated that it's disturbing. 0.01% of the population owns 50% of everything, 50% of all wealth, all assets. Whereas, we start living in a world that looks very different than when we as Americans expect, is sort of what he's saying. He's saying that when you look at the statistics, when you look at the numbers, when you abstract away from individuals who are wealthy to percentages of the country, percentages of the planet which are wealthy, you see these tendencies, you see these movements of assets and wealth and ownership that are not always apparent on the surface, do not always become obvious, but perhaps, when the younger generation is complaining about it being harder to grow economically, it becoming harder to head up the economic ladder, it's more difficult to afford food, then this isn't just because they aren't working harder. This is because the way that the economy acts is changing, and we perhaps should do something about that, because we know what it could be like. We've had these stories for decades of cyberpunkish futures where companies own almost everything, and everyone works for a company, and there's a few rich folk and a lot of poor folk. We have these historical examples of when there's nobles and kings and robber barons and the great industrialists, where there's a few rich folk and lots of poor folk. We live in a world today where there are a few rich folk, a lot of poor folk, and a substantial number of folk who are middle class, just, surviving in a way that is quite comfortable. They have to work, but they can retire. And they're not retiring just on Social Security. They're retiring on their own investments. And we're not becoming billionaires, but we're not ending up in the poorhouse either. And I say we because that's what I expect to happen to me, right? Like, that's the economic situation my parents grew up in. That's what I was told I was supposed to be. And I mean, here I am at 30-ish in a garage speaking to a camera with almost no money to my name, but a whole lot of books that I could sell for, 1/10 of what I bought them for, sort of thing. Okay, so next after this is part 4, which I will get to later. And I don't know how long this recording is. I just hope it's captured my voice the entire time. I really need to go to bed. I'll finish reading number 4 in the next 2 days or so, and then get back, report on that. I'm learning. It's great losing my voice, but learning, I mean, everything I'm learning makes me sort of sad and worried for the future, but still gaining knowledge.